Unfortunately, we live in a world that is full of lies, and some of these lies have seeped in to intellectual property. I always caution people, particularly entrepreneurs and even organizations, ensure that all you think you know about intellectual property is accurate. You will be shocked how many people hold inaccurate positions about intellectual property. You will be shocked. And so, whether you're an individual, whenever you're approaching the conversation on intellectual property, is in your best interest to approach such conversations from a point of accuracy, from a point of enabled, you are empowered, that you know what you're doing. Another caution that I always give people is this: ensure that you don't get introduced to intellectual property conversations when you are at the losing end. Because when an individual is at the losing end, an individual tends to be desperate, and we more often than not don't think rationally. And so it's very important that even as we go into this conversation, we are going into this conversation from a backdrop that we live in a world that is full of lies. And one such lie that has seeped into intellectual property is that in order for you to own your intellectual property, you need the permission of government. You need intervention of government. You need participation or the contribution of government. That is a lie. Intellectual property has nothing whatsoever to do with government. Intellectual property is a private facility. Intellectual property is a private property. It's a private form of property. Contrary to holding land, which land you might think that you actually own, but in order for an individual to exercise ownership over a parcel of property, that individual requires to be allowed, to be permitted, to be acknowledged by the state. And to that extent, the state acknowledges, or the state accords an individual something called a title deed. Now, that title deed is the extent of ownership, the extent of authority that your government has over that parcel of property. You might think you actually own it. You don't own that property. That's one of the reasons why when you will die, and let's say you don't get cremated, when we want to bury you, we are going only to bury you 6 feet under, because past 6 feet, that is another person's property, the government's property. In land law, there is a doctrine that is called the doctrine of eminent domain. And that doctrine of eminent domain says anything on the surface, anything that is found on the surface, anything that is beneath the surface, anything that is above the surface, all belong to government. And that is what, in as much as you might own land, but the extent that government performs, the duty that government performs in awarding or according you a title deed, is the extent to which you as an individual don't own that property. That is not the same with intellectual property. Because when we are talking about intellectual property, the mere fact of how we define intellectual property shows us that government's role is negated. Government's role is removed. And so it's important that we look at the definition around intellectual property. Intellectual property is anything that an individual can create from their mind, which that individual can actually commercialize. So that means that the source of intellectual property itself has no connection to do with government. Government did not give you your mind, so government cannot restrict what that mind creates or how that mind creates. That is the duty of the individual. That duty is you yourself who can either restrain it, you can either revoke it from you, you can either deny yourself the prerogative to create from your mind. But that one, no government can. And it's on the same basis that people worldwide challenge the constitutionality of the death penalty. Because the argument is this: government did not give you life. So if government did not give you life, government has no mandate in taking your life. That is out of a very simple legal maxim that says, he who gives or he who bestows on another has the prerogative to withdraw, has the power, the mandate to withdraw. So to that extent, government did not give you your mind, so government has little role to play with what that mind creates. And this lie has held so many people. When I interact with emerging entrepreneurs, when I interact with startups, I come to experience this a lot, because the conversation is this: do I need to register this? Mr. Gwang, I need to register this so that I can use it at the marketplace. I need to register this so that I can use it to the marketplace. Your intellectual property is a private property that you don't need government's permission in order for you to own. There are two things, there are two components that the state excuse me, there are two components that the state has a role to play. One, intellectual property law. So intellectual property law is this bundle of law that is different from one country and another. So this bundle of law is enacted with our parliaments. This bundle of law is actually gotten and assimilated and from other jurisdictions as well. They are ratified in so Kenya has ratified a lot of intellectual property treaties from other jurisdictions. So that is intellectual property law. To that extent, government has a say of how this legal ecosystem operates. Government has a say of how an individual can interact and how an individual can become a player in this legal ecosystem. So that is one. The other one is what it's called intellectual property rights. So intellectual property rights similarly are acknowledgements. They are privileges that governments accord to an individual who has approached a state agency to identify the individual as the first one to have applied for such privileges. And some of these rights include copyright. Copyright is a right, particularly in Kenya. Copyright is actually, the copyright certificate is given by the Kenya Copyright Board, which is a parastatal, right? When you're looking at trademark, in order for you to get trademark, regardless of the classes that you go for, trademark is also awarded by Kenya Industrial Property Institute, KIPI. The same with the patents, the same with industrial designs, the same with circuit boards, the same with plant and seed varieties. And so all these are different types of acknowledgements from the state. But guess what? One can actually have intellectual property without even giving undue consideration to intellectual property law. And someone can actually have intellectual property law and not even be aware of their intellectual property. One can similarly have intellectual property rights, which are mere acknowledgements. These are mere privileges that the government awards. Let me tell you, an individual can actually have their copyright certificate and not even be aware of what is hidden in their copyright capacity. That is what I really want us, that in order for us to take the conversation to the next level, it is your duty as an individual to spend more time to understand and to discover your intellectual property. Where markets are born is with intellectual property awareness. Intellectual property rights do not award anything that an individual did not have in the beginning. So it's important, excuse me, that even as we are going into creating markets, this channel is exclusively interested in that. How can you grow a market from your talent? Government did not give you your talent. How do you grow a market from your skill? Then this is the other thing that all of us need to qualify. In a society, we have what it's called a social contract. These are the things that we have agreed as a people that this we will allow, this we cannot allow. One of those things that we really consider in order for an individual even to grow a market out there is one, what you're bringing to the marketplace, excuse me, what you're bringing to the marketplace, is it moral? What you're bringing to the marketplace, is it ethical? What you're bringing to the marketplace, is it legal? What you're bringing to the marketplace, does it have good conscience? So if you can meet all those four requirements, then guess what? You can go out there and create a market from whatsoever your mind has created. It is that simple. The greatest lie that has been sold in intellectual property is that you need government's permission. No, you don't need government's permission. You only need government's permission to the extent that government is a custodian of our social contracts, our social duties at the societal levels, what we have agreed as a people, and government is the custodian because government is the person that holds the instruments of coercion, the instruments of beating people into alignment. So let's go back. Do you have intellectual property? Have you identified how your mind creates? Have you identified how intellectual property expresses itself all around you? Have you identified the uniqueness of what you have in your skill set? Have you identified the uniqueness in what you have in your talent? Talent is the least exploited form of intellectual property because we have never distinguished between what is intellectual property and the expression of that talent. Similarly, even in creativity, we have never distinguished what are the intellectual property components in creativity and the expression of creativity. Knowledge is another uncharted space as far as intellectual property is concerned, because we have never appreciated that knowledge is proprietary. Proprietary simply means something that an individual can own, something that an organization can own. So moving forward, I want you from today to know that my intellectual property is my private property. My intellectual property is my private facility. This is something that I can leave to my children. This is something that I can leave for my posterity. This is something that I can assign to someone else. This is something that I can rent out to someone else. This is something that I can lease out to someone else. This is something that I can license to someone else. The possibilities are literally endless. But it begins with you knowing intellectual property is exclusively yours. So that means if you're not doing anything from your intellectual property, guess whom you need to blame? The person who, when you look at the mirror, they are staring you back. You're probably the person who is holding yourself from the greatest discovery of your life. Your mind at any given moment is constantly thinking, it's constantly creating, is constantly making impressions to you as an individual. So that is the greatest lie, and that lie is holding people back, because people think of ridiculous amount of resources that you need in order for you to get some of these acknowledgements by the state, like intellectual property rights. And organizations that have come up, particularly private state-owned corporations like parastatals, particularly in Kenya, now that they don't get most of their funding from the full funding from the exchequer, they came up with ingenious ways of growing their own books. And that is why they're always telling you, have you registered for that copyright? You don't need even to register for copyright. Copyright is a facility that the moment you set out to do any work of physical nature, just know copyright is available there. Copyright is present. Copyright is a facility that exists the moment an individual sets out to perform a task of physical nature. If you found this conversation exciting, if you found this conversation interesting, I would kindly ask you to consider subscribing, liking, just share with someone. You don't know who will find some of this conversation liberating. We need to liberate ourselves at the marketplace. We need to appear in our own marketplaces from a point of empowerment. We need to appear in our own marketplaces from a point of we are enabled to compete aggressively against our competitors, our peers from other parts of the world. Nothing liberates an individual. Nothing liberates an organization at the marketplace like intellectual property. And if you're new here, kindly subscribe and don't forget to click that bell button, and I will see you in the next video. Until then, take care, God bless, and bye-bye.